Cath, great to have you on this episode of the podcast.
Lovely to be here, Guy.
Now, you and I know each other. We've got a little bit of history of having known each other in previous roles and doing a little bit of work together. So for me, it's absolutely fantastic just to re-engage with you on here. I'd really be grateful of just that one-liner of the role that you have and what it is that you're doing right now before we get into the deeper detail.
Sure. So my job title is Chief Exec of Recruiting Group in the British Army. So what that means is I head the partnership between Capita and the British Army to deliver all recruiting. So that's regular and reserves for the Army, and soldiers and officers. And my team are responsible for everything from the TV adverts that you see right through to the point at which a recruit enters basic training.
So pretty expansive.
Yeah, and interesting, and it includes medicals, it includes physical assessments, it incorporates all of those career centres around the country that people see on the high street. And it involves a team of about 1,400 people, blended between the military, it's about 500 military, and around 900 civilians.
So we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty of what that feels like and what the reality of that is to work in that context. I guess what I'd really like to do is get a sense of the journey that took you to the role that you inhabit now, just to give a sense of the stepping stones that led to the position that you inhabit.
I definitely didn't plan this, but it's an interesting serendipity to the way my career has worked out, I guess. When I was 18, I walked into an Army Career Centre because in Chelmsford, in Essex, where I grew up, you could do a 3-year short service commission then, and I thought it would be a great thing to do between school and university. And I'd always been really interested in the military, so I screwed up my courage and pressed the doorbell and walked into this career centre and was met by a older male sergeant who looked at me like I was slightly mad. Definitely made me feel like I didn't belong. So I kind of walked out again 5 minutes later, a bit disappointed and deflated and confused, and dismissed all thoughts of a military career. And I was very into sport, so I ended up doing a sports science degree up at Loughborough, and from then fell into recruiting, just because I wasn't sure what else I wanted to do. And I had a friend who literally said to me, you're gobby, you'd be good at recruitment. It was as simple as that. And so I then worked in a variety of different recruitment, mainly recruitment outsourcing situations. And now I find myself through a couple of different roles in Capita before this one. Running large-scale recruitment outsourcing solutions effectively has been most of my career. And now I'm running the British Army's recruitment outsourcing solution. The irony of ironies, from back when I was 18, feeling dismissing thoughts of a military career, I've ended up working alongside a Major General. So in the eyes of the Army, I have the equivalent rank of a Major General, which never ceases to amaze me. And obviously that career centre in Chelmsford is now part of the team that I run. And I know that if my 18-year-old self was to walk in there now, I'd have a very different experience. So it has a nice, there's a nice poetic.
I like that. First of all, I'm going to start calling you Mark. I think that's appropriate.
Please.
So I think
it makes me feel very old. I do not.
Well, I won't do that. But I do have this. It's funny when you talk about going into that army centre. I wonder if unconsciously you're not a boy. Why have you walked in?
Oh, I'm sure there's a bit of that. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and diversity and driving greater both gender and ethnic diversity into the army is a very, very key goal of ours at the moment, and difficult to do, and a huge challenge.
So let's just look at that partnership between Capita, which in itself is quite an entity, is I think one of the largest employees in the UK, if I remember.
Probably.
Second or third. Yeah, something like that. It's a significant size of enterprise. And the Army, you've got that private commercial culture and the military culture. And I think just regardless of actually making something like this work, the pure dynamics of those two cultures and operating within it before you even actually get going on what it is that you've got to do. I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, and I think everyone would recognise that in the early days of RPP, as we're called, the Recruiting Partnership Project, started in 2012, both Capita and the Army probably got it wrong in the way we approached the partnership. And instead of doing what it was intended to do, which was to leverage the best of the civilian expertise and the best of the military expertise to form a greater whole, effectively, what we got was the worst of both sides of the partnership. It took both organisations a while to recognise that, but the power of the change, now we've achieved that, has been really impressive and really telling. And there's been all sorts of press coverage. There's been 2 NAO investigations, National Audit Office investigations into the contract. But in 2018, both organisations came together under the leaders, so the Capita Chief Exec John Lewis and the head of the Army at the time, Sir Nick Carter, who both have said, right, enough is enough. We've all made mistakes here, but let's draw a line and move forward. And we want this partnership to be an exemplar of private-public sector partnering. And therefore, as our leadership teams, we are challenging you and empowering you to do something about it and to change the dynamic. That was the point at which I was stepping up into my current role, and a new general on the side of the Army, a guy called Paul Manson, was stepping into his role. And the two of us were very fortunate, and we had, I suppose, a real advantage over our predecessors in that we had that absolute empowerment from the top of both organisations to change how we went about things. So we entered the challenge with a real attitude of wanting to trust one another, wanting to collaborate and change the way the organisations work together. We came in April, May 2018, just as we were entering our worst period as a partnership in terms of results after a really, really difficult IT go live. And that year, 18-19, was the low point of performance. And it took us a time to turn it around. But in 19-20, we hit 100% of the target, something which people a year ago would have thought was unachievable, which was great to see. And the things that really unlocked that were about trust, collaboration, openness, willingness to take risks on both sides, and making sure that we respected one another's expertise, opinions, and skills and really leveraged those. So a good example of that would be putting young role model soldiers into those career centres that I talked about earlier, and taking out some of the older predecessors who were less able to relate to our candidates, and putting those young role model soldiers alongside really great civilian corporate recruiters, and making sure that a candidate experienced the best of both in terms of coming through the process into the army.
There's a lot in there. It's an easy thing that you've just said, particularly having to manage a relationship. I know Paul, and he's a standout character, I think, just amazing. In terms of his integrity and his transparency, and he's a great guy. There's something, though, about having to create a partnership and a relationship while you're sitting on the results of something that's hitting the media and hitting the world, saying in some respects it's at fault, and those immortal words, yes, but we're changing it. It's it's like, well, of course you'd say that, but actually no, we really are. Yeah. But having to manage people to believe, maybe primarily in the relationship between you and Paul.
Yeah, there was quite a lot of that, and we recognised quite early on that if we were going to change the performance, that we needed to create some breathing space for the teams. They were very, very change weary, having gone through, a lot of them have been there since the beginning, having gone through 6-7 years of failing to hit targets, massive public criticism, being part of an adversarial relationship because both military and civilian were frustrated by our inability to deliver what everyone wanted to deliver. And there was a lot of external interference and kind of silver bullet solutions that they would get constantly under pressure to implement, which then went wrong and so caused more issues. And so we needed to give them some breathing space and just give them, I suppose metaphorically, put our foot on the ball, as they say in football, take a knee, as Paul talks about in military parlance. And to do that, we had to get ourselves some breathing space by giving some of those external stakeholders that we had to manage the confidence that we were doing the right thing. Because absolutely it does take time to turn an operation of that size around. And we did that by really joining up in terms of data and having complete ownership of any data that left the headquarters, because the ability for one piece of data to go one place and one place to another place, and that to cause a rift or an issue is significant. And what we did was be really clear that as we turned the ship around, there would be some green shoots, we called them, of data in the early in the recruitment pipeline. So, for example, right at the front, application volumes going up is a clear positive indicator. And then as candidates start to come through the process, the conversion rates and the volumes at those early stages of the process would be the proof that would show that our plans were working. And we were very clear on, look at those indicators. Don't look at the numbers coming into training right now because they're not where they need to be yet, but they will be if you trust in these early indicators. And we used our line managers above us, so the 3-star general, a general called Lieutenant General Ty Urch, and my boss in Capita, to manage the Capita, the Army, the politicians and the MOD, that stakeholder kind of nexus who were all really interested in wanting solutions and wanting data constantly. We leveraged those people above us and to really focus on, look, the plan is sound, but you need to give us some space. But look, we will give you the data, but it will be the data as the plan progresses, you'll see those green shoots start to move through the rest of the pipeline. And eventually, you will see it in more soldiers into training, which is what happened.
So that's something about managing the narrative and ensuring that both you and Paul have absolutely, you've got your own individual voices for your own audiences, but actually when those people come together, they're in essence hearing the same thing.
Yes, and we realised quite early that although it was great to have that level of interest and support from our senior stakeholders, it was critical that we spoke with one voice, and the partnership at our level absolutely had one narrative. So, and we were burnt quite early on with that. So I might have told something to my Capita superiors that ended up going across to the Army and down to Paul before I'd had the chance to tell Paul. He was like, well, what the hell? So we, once we
I thought we had an agreement.
Once we identified that risk, we corrected it. And so, nothing goes from me up to Capita unless I've spoken to Paul about it, and vice versa. So we are really, really clear that in order to keep that coherence, which is so important at our level and with our teams, that we need to speak with one voice and be completely transparent with one another, which is what we did. Yeah, and it made a real difference.
So trust is this massive factor, isn't
Trust
it?
Trust is a huge factor. And it's interesting because now kind of coming to the end of our journey as a partnership, because Paul's about to retire from the army, we've been reflecting on that journey, and we absolutely pinpointed trust as being critical. It was interesting, and we reflected that we kind of allowed it to build organic. We didn't sit down at the outset and contract how we were going to work together. We just instinctively trusted one another, and we were lucky. I think we were reflecting on it. We were lucky. It did work. But now, as I embark on my next partnership with Paul's replacement, who's a guy called Chris Bell, who's fantastic. I have consciously now, Chris and I have sat down together, and we have gone through a whole bunch of relationship contracting activity, so that we consciously make those decisions about how we're going to lead together, where we're going to consult one another, how we want to receive feedback, how we will work with our various superiors, what our joint goals are, etc., to try and fast track the development of that trust, because that relationship is, in our situation, a contract like this is so critical.
So when you look at that change that you've driven, some of that has been wrapped up in some of the things that you've said. But if you had to almost say what had to change, what was it culturally that had to change on both sides, or the meeting in the bridge in the middle, to actually make something like this work?
So I think there was some core elements. Like Paul identified that we needed the teams to feel really empowered at all levels to drive change. There are two ways in which we went about doing that. For the military, they talk about mission command, which is about the commander setting their strategic intent, and then the subordinates being clear on what that intent is, but having the freedom to operate in order to deliver that intent, if that makes sense. And Paul absolutely drove that mission command through the military chain. Separately, for the civilians, we needed exactly the same effect. We needed people to feel like if they saw an issue or challenge in their particular area of sphere of operation, that they fix it. Whereas previously, the issue would be people on the ground would see a problem, they would tell their boss, and then they think they've done their job, and they would wait.
Be subordinate to the hierarchy,
yeah, exactly.
I guess.
Very, very hierarchical.
Fearful of
very hierarchical,
being accountable.
Very command and control, which meant that we just couldn't adapt and react as we needed to. So we coined a phrase called "Be Your Own CEO." And CEO stood for curiosity, empowerment, and ownership.
Boom. Love that.
And importantly, that message was driven consistently to the teams again and again and again through a number of interventions. And we really needed to take the top 90 to 100 in my organisation, 1,400. Effectively, most of them were operating as managers, and I needed them to be leaders. They needed to really lead their particular areas of the operation. And so we brought them together and gave them a real identity as we called them, the extended leadership team, and invested significantly in a programme we called the Inclusive Leadership Programme. But that was all about driving Be Your Own CEO message at the heart of it, but with a really, really heavy focus on driving an inclusive culture in the organisation. Our marketing promises in the Army is about belonging. This is belonging. Find where you belong. That's what the Army marketing is all about. And if that's not true for our own people, then how on earth are they going to carry that message out to the candidates? So we invested quite significantly in doing that. And that was tough because, remember, we were operationally under massive pressure, and taking people out of delivering targets to spend time on this inclusive leadership programme was a tough decision, and one which wasn't necessarily immediately supported by all of my leadership team. But actually, it made a huge difference in terms of that driving that cultural sense of belonging, helping everybody to have a common lexicon, because the programme we went through gave us all a common lexicon around leadership and around inclusion, and all of our military and civilian leaders went through it. It wasn't just the civilian team, and it made a real cultural difference. And the change in some of my leaders they're unrecognisable from 2 years ago, which is fantastic.
There is something about the bravery to take people out of their context, do work with them, when actually there's maybe an air of panic or an air of momentum that actually says, to pause and create time to do something like this it's very difficult for some people to comprehend, actually, that we haven't got that time, or can't we do it when we've sorted it?
Oh, absolutely. And that was why it was initially a tough one to get through with all of my particularly operational leadership, who were focused on delivering the operation, quite rightly. But we believed collectively, we believed passionately that unless we unlocked that cultural change in the organisation, that we'd never get to where we need to be. So, and fortunately, it was the right thing.
100%. In terms of results, you talked about hitting targets, but where was it when you and Paul walked in to obviously hitting that target. What has been the shift?
Well, in quarter one of the 18-19 recruiting years, that's April to June 2018, which was as Paul and I stepped into our roles on either side of the partnership, that was the worst quarter that the partnership had ever seen. I think we delivered, in the first quarter, you should deliver broadly 25%. Because of the way we do seasons, it's not quite that. But you certainly should have delivered about 20% of the annual target in that first quarter, and we did only 7%. And that was the worst quarter. So we were literally at the nadir of the partnership results as we came in. And then over time, the first quarter that we saw the results of what the work we did was quarter four of that year, so January to March 2019, which was the best quarter that the partnership had yet had. And then we surpassed that again the following year, because by then we had the right people in the right roles, doing their jobs well, feeling empowered, feeling accountable. The relationship and the trust was there. We'd made some policy and process changes to really unlock things. And so last year, the 1920 year, we really flew, and we delivered that magic 100% of the target.
And I briefly touched what you were doing when you were in role, just very, very briefly. And I do remember something around some of the processes that were the timeline it might take somebody from application that actually almost meant they may have become disinterested or gone and done something else in between. And that seemed to me one of those clear things that shortening that process, that regardless of anything else, there were hurdles and blockages in the way, just in the systems itself.
Yeah, and it is. It's difficult because it's got to balance the fact that, we're not recruiting for Tesco. It's a massive life choice and vocation choice to join the army. And there are necessarily complexities that have to be gone through, such as medicals, which is probably the longest pole in the tent as far as recruiting process is concerned, fitness standards, background checks, etc. So it does make it complicated, but it was unnecessarily lengthy. We've done quite a lot to shorten it, and we have. The process has shortened significantly over the last 18 months. But what we really tried to do more than anything else is to generate flexibility into the time frame, because there are some candidates who need to be able to improve their fitness significantly, or who want to finish their degree before they start, or who want to get married, or who need to lose half a stone, or whatever it is. But equally, there are some who know exactly what they want to do, super fit, and dying to get in, and they should be able to go through as fast as they want. So actually, fast as someone's gone through start to finish is 16 days from application to getting a job offer, which actually even most call most call centres struggle to do. So you can, if you're really super ready and you're on it, you can get through very fast. But then equally, we're building the flexibility. So actually, if you need to take longer, you want to take longer, then that's okay too. And our challenge is got to juggle that in terms of the candidate preferences, needs, with the training needs of the army, which require us. It's not just a case of recruit 9,404, which was the target last year for soldiers. It's not just recruit 9,404 people into the army. It's recruit 9,404 across about 250 different trade groups and age profiles and genders, which no one thinks, normally you think, let's just recruit for the army. Well, it's not, because actually each month we need to have a certain number of women or men, or junior entry or senior entry, across 76 different job roles. But actually it's week by week. Demand plan, the training spaces are laid out week by week. So this week it's 25 Coldstream Guards, 25 Irish Guards, 3 chefs, 5 dog handlers, 3 ammo techs, 22 drivers, etc., right across a vast plethora of different trades. So the challenge as recruiters is to get the candidates through the process, which is complicated in itself, but at the right time horizon, and in a way in which we help them with their trade choices so that we can meet those complex demands of the army. And that's what makes it, and we talk about landing a jumbo jet on a pinhead, that's what makes it difficult. And very different to a normal recruiting job where you would advertise a specific role, people apply for a specific role, and they start it as soon as you can recruit them, generally. It's very, very different in recruiting for the army.
You never quite understand the complexity of a thing until you actually are inside and doing it, or somebody that is doing it explains it to you. Because saying 9,500 people into the army, it was almost like a numbers game. But when you actually look at the variables, then you go, no, but this is a complexity issue.
Exactly. And the politicians particularly get very fixated on our conversion rate as well, which used to be about, and when the contract started, it was about for every 12 applicants, one person would become a soldier. It's now broadly between 8 and 9 to 1. And actually, when you think that most call centres, their conversion rate is about 15 to 1, and the police, I think, were at around about 10 to 12 to 1, and we have got medicals and fitness tests and things that no corporate organisation has to deal with. Actually, a conversion rate of 8 or 9 to 1 is really very good.
If somebody was listening to this and they were being devil's advocate and said, well, did you just make it easier?
Good question. And generally we hear that a lot. No, I mean, I think the ultimate measure of that is the output from training and the standards of training. I heard recently, actually, there's a senior and non-commissioned officers. So these are the sergeants. So all the people that come through us and go through training end up with the sergeants in the field army. There was a survey recently, and they believe that the quality of the soldiers they are receiving out of training has gone up in the last year. So for me, I think quality is not an issue. We have jointly with the Army looked at some of those particularly medical policy issues which were constraining numbers and tried to contemporise some of those. So for example, asthma is a classic example, where if you used an inhaler at all in the previous 4 years, we used to be unable to join the Army. So we would have candidates maybe who had a chest infection when they were 16, and the doctor, because doctors quite often prescribe inhalers if you have a bit of a chest infection. The doctor prescribed an inhaler, then that person wouldn't be able to join the Army until they were 20. And the Army, in consultation, working with us, has relaxed that now. So that's only 1 year if you have used an inhaler.
Is it things like tattoos as well?
Tattoos, that was eased a little while ago, which is so previously you couldn't have a tattoo at all on your hands or on your neck. You now can have a tattoo on the back of your hands or on the back of your neck, as long as it doesn't show in a passport photo or when you're saluting. There's a more relaxed attitude to tattoos as well. I'm always challenging the Army and we laugh about it. I mean, a great example of something I'd like to see relaxed is a policy around beards. Unless it's religious reasons, you still cannot have a beard in the Army. And actually quite a lot of our target audience have beards and would not want to shave it off to join the Army. So,
I see a lot of pictures of guys in operations that they seem to have beards.
Yes, I mean, we laugh about it, but that's the benefits of having a private sector partner who's going to challenge you and ask questions all the time. And we have really good, healthy debates about these things to try and push things forward.
Conversions is one thing, but I think that conversions and quality message is quite powerful. Independently, there's some good there. The conversion rate hasn't gone up, but the quality has, but actually put those two together, and that's actually quite a positive message for me as a inverted commas civilian who would like to think that I've got good people guarding the borders.
Yeah, that's a great counter as well to the so-called Snowflake Campaign that we ran last year, and unfortunately was, sometimes willfully misunderstood by some, I think maybe genuinely misunderstood by others, that we were suggesting that we were recruiting snowflakes for the Army. Clearly that's not what we're doing.
That really brings me into my next question, which is the Snowflake Campaign, and some people may not quite know where that came from or what that meant. I remember when it came out, I sometimes see an advert or something. I'd love to have been in the meeting where somebody suggested that. And that, are you joking, from one person all the way through to, that's absolutely goddamn genius from another. I'd love, that must have been a moment, but I'd like to just hear that. How did it come to be? And then did you think, there is going to be a reaction to this, or was it a surprise? And then having to weather that reaction, and then boom, the results of it come in. It sounds like just a great story.
It was fascinating to be part of. I mean, one of my favourite meetings of the year, every year now, are when we sit down with the marketing guys and look at next year's campaign and start discussing, seeing the early creative ideas. And we're already in those meetings now for January 21, and I can't tell you what they're going to be, but no, I can't wait. The Snowflake Campaign was year 3, actually, of our what we call our belonging campaign. It was a build upon the previous 2 years, and what we identified through a lot of qualitative and quantitative research was that one of the really unique benefits of the Army was that sense of belonging, being a part of something, family sense. And everyone in the Army talks about it, and it's really recognisable. We related it to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is the psychology everyone knows who's ever done any psychology at school or university, and that the importance of belonging comes above basic health, food and shelter. Belonging was a campaign idea that we launched a couple of years before. We started off with a really simple message about, this is about belonging. Join the Army, find belonging, find where you belong. In the second year, we wanted to make that feel relevant and attainable for everybody. We did quite a controversial campaign that year, actually, but we really focused our adverts on appealing to more women, more ethnic minorities, different religious backgrounds, LGBTQ, to really hammer home that message that belonging is attainable for everybody. And it doesn't mean just the superhero over there who's really fit, white male. It means you can be attainable for everybody. The Snowflake Campaign was taking that on a further stage, which is really seeing about, because of belonging, someone like me can really realise my potential. And it was all about talking to the generation which was being labelled with really pejorative, offensive labels by wider society, but talking to that generation, saying, actually, we really see you and we see your potential, and you can belong here and do something that really matters.
Because it was snowflakes, selfie addicts, it was me millennials,
gamers,
it was phone zombies.
All of that.
Google Snowflake Campaign Army and just understand that from that harder, your country needs you, man with gun, this really came at it from a fundamentally different way.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, we've still got the campaign mandate up on the walls around the office, and it still gives me a kind of moment. Boom, boom moment when I see it now. It's so powerful. But ironically, to your question about being in the meetings where we talked about it, when I first saw those posters, which are basically, for the listeners, a parody on Kitchener World War One posters, and it was all about your army needs you. So snowflakes, binge gamers, your army needs you. And actually, what I thought was going to be incredibly controversial and get the headlines when they launched was the Kitchener reference and the World War One reference, because this was, remember, 2018 when we were conceiving the campaign. It came out in January 2019. And obviously, the centenary of World War One was very much in it. And I thought the adverse reaction or the controversy would be about us doing the Echoes of Kitchener thing. I didn't think it was going to be about the labels, because I thought that it was so obvious we weren't calling people snowflakes. We were taking mickey out of how society has labelled that generation. But actually, when the campaign launched, January the 3rd, 2019, I remember it so well. that was what got the headlines. And it was an incredible rollercoaster 24 hours. We did launch at the MOD main building in London, and my marketing director, Nick Terry, and the Army's colonel that we worked with, Ben, jointly stood up and did the launch. And we had CNN, I think, in the room, ITV, BBC. Yeah. We also had Dame Kelly Holmes and some of the other big military authors who are real influencers on Twitter, because we wanted them to understand the rationale behind the campaign and to be supporters of it. So it was a really interesting mixed audience of media folk and influencers. It went down brilliantly, and Nick Terry, my marketing director, was on Radio 1 being interviewed, and Colonel Ben was on ITV News. Yeah, and it was an incredible day of just, wow, what a high. And then I went home that night, and I put something on LinkedIn about how proud I was of the campaign and how excited. Yeah. And I went home and I went to bed, and I got a phone call at 11 o'clock at night from my social media manager. I thought, why is she ringing? And she said, Cath, look at Fill Your Boots. Fill Your Boots is a military banter site on Facebook, basically. Someone had screenshot my LinkedIn post and put it on this site. And by that 11 o'clock that night, there were something like 170 posts of just vicious, nasty personal abuse against me because of this campaign. And I was completely floored. I couldn't...
That's a high and a low.
Yeah, I mean, it was the most incredible high to the most incredible low in the space of 24 hours. And then there was an incredible noise on my LinkedIn post as well of debate and challenge and argument. It was fascinating. And actually, my favourite LinkedIn comment on that post was someone saying, she must be getting paid by Putin. She's single-handedly ruining the British military, which I thought was...
Can you go back to that person and go, ta-da?
I decided to rise above it, but I took a screenshot, and I do chuckle at it frequently. And obviously we had the last laugh, because by March we were getting headlines in the press that was saying that the highest application rate in any January ever.
It's fascinating, because on those posters, one of the other things that almost goes uncommented about is and your focus and your compassion and your drive. They're not the headline grabber, but they are in there as well. Exactly. As in, you are a gamer, but that takes focus. When you say snowflake, well, actually, we see compassion. Yeah. There is this willful disassociation by the media. It doesn't sell papers to go, this is great. But retrospectively, of course, you couldn't have got that much advertising if it had been vanilla.
Well, no, and we do. Let's be honest. We deliberately seek the headlines. I mean, we didn't expect we were going to get that much reaction to that campaign, but we want the front pages of the press. We want to be talked about on Piers Morgan and This Morning and those kind of programs, because that helps everyone notice us. Most advertising goes by unnoticed. I think there's a stat like 89% of advertising is not even noticed, and you've got to be noticed. We deliberately caught that kind of controversy to an extent. Yeah.
That leads me into, you use that phrase Nexus, which is a great phrase of the army, the politicians, the press, and the MOD. And I think what's always fascinated me about your role, it isn't just about managing a senior tier and, inverted commas, stakeholders, which often exist in a commercial context, but we're dealing with distinct bodies that are representative in the culture. And of course, and then everything you do is open to observation from social media, from the most intellectually and verbally fluent individual to a person that probably shouldn't be allowed a keyboard. So I'm fascinated by that army, politic, press, MOD.
And Capita. Don't forget Capita. Managing my own bosses is just as tricky.
Of course, yeah. And let's add that one to the pot. And Capita, which is, again, an entity in itself. Just a little bit of understanding, almost, I want to do this, but I've now got to manage it through that sea of people. I'm fascinated by that.
Yeah, I don't know. I suppose
I don't know. Let's move on.
There's a bit of trial and error, and there's definitely getting it wrong. And as I alluded to earlier, when Paul and I recognised that we needed to be so careful about a joint view of the partnership for any of those stakeholders, we were probably foolish in the early days of the partnership of not recognising the importance, particularly of the press as a key stakeholder group, and just soaking up the criticism and not responding to it, and not trying to proactively engage them and help them understand what we were doing. So we've absolutely rectified that in the last couple of years. Capita has a PR team, and that PR team now works very, very closely with the Army's media and PR team, so that we can be really clear if any stories are coming out, what the view of the partnership and the response of the partnership is to those stories. And we also, in February this year, we proactively worked together to invite all of the defence correspondents up to Harrogate, which is the Army Sixth Form College, where Paul and I then jointly presented to them about what we've been doing and the results and the journey we've been on. So we've tried, I think the important thing in dealing with a group, a nexus of stakeholders like that, is just making sure you consider them all the time, and you don't react, but you proactively plan which group needs to have which message at which time, and who is going to deliver that message, and how are you going to deliver it, so that you, instead of reacting to events, you are slightly more master of your own destiny in terms of how that plays out. It doesn't always work. I've learned a lot in the course of this job, and had some great support from both Capita and the Army in doing that.
And I guess it's much easier to hold a position when you've actually done a change around, as opposed to those first opening salvos when people have got the opportunity to say, well, you're wrong, because you've got no frame of reference for being right.
Absolutely. And even now when things are working well, you still get, well, yeah, but it was rubbish for the first 6 years, which is fair enough. We did get it wrong. You have to hold your hands up to that. But we're much more focused on looking forwards.
But also, it's not a speedboat, is it? It's not a thing that you can change on a whim.
No. I think in terms of the wider societal influence and interest and social media commentary, I think one of the things we've done really well in the last year or so, year and a half, is just myself, some of my team and some of the senior Army team actually is deliberately and proactively supporting one another on Twitter, which is where there's an awful lot of military presence on Twitter, and highlighting the good news stories around recruiting and training, and then making sure we tagged one another in those posts, so that it's very clear to anyone looking that this is a partnership and the approach is a joint one.
There's a cross-pollination.
Lots of cross-pollination, cross-fertilisation.
Yeah. It's almost mummy and daddy are in agreement kind of thing, right?
There's a little bit of that. Yeah.
So that final thing for me is it almost can't not be spoken about in some respects, because we're in the middle of lockdown. I just wondered the reality of applications and people being seen. Has that changed anything? What's the reality of that process that you're in?
Sure. So we had to all the recruits got sent home from basic training initially for a few weeks, just as an immediate response to contain any potential outbreaks in training establishments, which obviously have thousands of people in them. And it also meant that we had to stop our assessment centres, which is where normally candidates would come for a couple of days and a couple of nights and do medical tests, fitness tests, cognitive tests, and really get that experience of living in a barracks as well for a couple of nights, because that might be the only time they will experience it before they then join. So we had to close those. We also had to close the 68 Army High Street career centres around the country. But what we did quite quickly, and the team responded brilliantly, was to move all of the activity we'd normally do in those career centres just went online. We had lots of online content anyway, but we make sure that we curated it in a way that was really accessible and easy to navigate for the candidate. And then we had the Army briefs that would normally be done face-to-face in a career centre were done over FaceTime or WhatsApp, using all the tech that we have available to us. And actually, fascinating, both the feedback from both recruiters and candidate alike has been really positive to that. For candidates, it's much less intimidating than ringing on the doorbell of a career centre and walking in and seeing. So it's much easier to sit on your sofa and open your laptop. And therefore, our teams have been much more productive in that space because no one's not turning up. Normally we have 20%, I think, or so who... Yeah,
we know exactly where you are. Yeah. You're in lockdown.
You normally have a chunk of people who make an appointment and don't show up for it. So it's wasting time, but you don't have any of that in lockdown. So that's been interesting. And the team's pivoted brilliantly in terms of... So that candidate experience is still really positive in the early stages of the pipeline. We're just in the last couple of weeks reopening our assessment centres with a much reduced capacity, no overnight stays at the moment. Had to equip our doctors with PPE. There's a really rigorous cleaning regime. And we are spacing candidates out so they are socially distanced when they come in, and we're therefore our capacity is reduced to about 600 a month through assessment centres at the moment, whereas normally we'd have a couple of thousand. So a lot of work at the moment is going into working out how we can safely increase those volumes despite the constraints we've got to deal with. And we have seen a bit of an uptick in applications as well during March and April and May. But it's interesting, and the profile of those applications has changed. So we've got fewer young males and more older people applying. When I say older, late 20s, early 30s type age groups.
Oh,
It makes me
God.
very old.
Yeah, I just...
But yeah, so it'd be interesting to see how the applications perform
Yeah.
and convert, actually, because it's a very different profile of applicants.
Looking forward into the future, because I know that's really how you operate, Cath. The past is what it is. Let's learn from it, but let's step into the future. What is either the future for the focus that you've got within the role, or anything that is worth an observation or commentary to?
Yeah, well, I think right now, I think it's interesting. So our focus is utterly on recovering the operation post-COVID, adapting to whatever new normal looks like. Principally is delivering the Army's targets for this year. So that's 9,867 regular soldiers, 2,500 reservists, 700 or so officers. And I think it's a commentary on how far the team has come, in that having delivered 100% of the target last year, no one's blinking in the face of dealing with a pandemic and an increased target, and effectively having lost 2 to 3 months of working because we couldn't run the assessment centres and training was shut. Everyone still believes that we will do the target, which is fabulous for me to see. I suppose it's a commentary on the culture and the power of success breeding more success, and self-belief and confidence. The confidence in the team is really palpable, which is great. And so for me, it's about doing that. And then it's also about discussions that we're having around extending the contract, because it comes to an end in 2022, but there's the option to carry on for 2 years. So we're having those discussions at the moment with the MOD and the Army. And beyond that, beyond that period, then what we really want to do, our vision statement as a team, is to become world-class leaders in defence recruiting. And we want, absolutely, to run Navy and RAF recruiting as well. So that's the real goal. And that would be really exciting.
Well, listen, Cath, I'm going to bring this to a close. It's been an absolute joy speaking to you, and I just thank you for the commentary, your observations, and just what seems like one heck of a journey that I can feel your pride in it. I imagine there's a huge amount of pride in place that may not have been there some time ago, but it feels as if that's something that we'll be living with people and they'll be proud of and talking about for some time. Yeah,
the team are, and rightly, the team have been amazing. And some of them particularly who've been around since the beginning, the journey they've all gone on. It's been phenomenal. And to show that two organisations as different as Capita and the Army can produce something that is so much more than the sum of its parts, I think, which has been fabulous. And I'm really hoping that what we've done can support learnings and better outsourcing partnerships between private and public sector going forward, because undoubtedly the public sector needs the private sector and vice versa. And we can do so much better at working together, I think.
On that note, Cath, thank you so much.
Thank you guys, it's been great.